just over here.
Just crying.
Okay. So I believe we are live, but I will give just a moment for people to tune in and to, make sure everything's sort of going. I will say I'm very looking forward to this discussion. For people who are just tuning in now, we have a little pre-conversation the day before, and some of the conversations that came up was, I think, will be of great interest to everybody. So it's going to be a very good conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And also for those of you who are working or who are watching right now, we're going to answer some specific questions today, and that will be kind of how the day will go. But I believe we're in, and I just wanted to introduce Dr. Paul Garrow, who is here with us this week. He is new to our discussion, but not new to the course. And of course, we have Dr. Tracy Bear with us. And I think we've given enough time for people to find us. So I turn it over to the two of you for today.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we've got a new face today, and this is my amazing colleague, Dr. Paul Gareau, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much, Tanse. My name is Paul Garrow. I'm Métis and French Canadian from a small village in Saskatchewan called Bellevue, near Batoche, Saskatchewan. I'm the academic lead on this MOOC. So that means that I've taken what Tracy and Leah Rosen have organized and put together, this amazing course, and launched in 2017, and I've been taking care of it since. So you don't see me in the videos, but I'm in the background all the time. So that's exactly where I want to be, is just helping out, tending this garden of the MOOC, which is really wonderful. So I'm here to support our MOOC, to support Dan and the community that we've brought together to learn and to sort of like understand Indigenous experience and unpack settler Canadian experiences as well, right? So in perspective. So I'm very honored to be here and very excited. Thank you.
Well, we're very lucky to have you. So thank you for being with us this week.
Yeah, awesome. So I think it was so good for me to smudge before. I'm thinking that we'll have a quick smudge again. And I was always taught, and everyone has their own teachings about smudging, but I was taught that you take off your jewelry and your watches and your glasses and things like that. Now, you don't need a real fancy bowl to smudge in. Lots of people smudge in shells and things like that. But this was a gift from someone very special. And the smudge, again, that I'm going to be using today is some sage that we picked in Batoche last year. And a little match. And so, like I said last week, smudging is a very personal thing. And it's just like if you're in a shower and you're cleansing yourself, you're washing your hair and things like that. This smoke, the sacred smoke, is just like that. And so you're washing your spirit in this way. And so I always like to put my hands over top of it, wash my hands so they do good things. Breathe it in. And you notice I smudge my eyes so I see good things, and my ears so I do good or hear good things, and then speak good things as well. And my hair, I just like the smell of it, so stays with me throughout the day. So here's our smudge for today, and let us start this conversation in a really good way, with open hearts and open minds, and see what we can learn. Sound good?
Yes. Thank you. So I think just, it's always good, I guess, to start at the beginning in terms of This week's lesson was about the fur trade. So I thought if there was anything you wanted to add in terms of the significance of this chapter in the 12 weeks of this program.
Yeah, one of the things that we get is like, why talk about the fur trade in the way that we do? And it goes back to the worldview that we had in the first module and how we live our lives and tell our lives through story. And I shared this little piece with everyone, with Dan and Paul yesterday. And I just want to read a little bit from this book. It's Life Stages of Native Women, and it's written by Kim Anderson, and the foreword is done by Maria Campbell. Maria Campbell, quite famous Métis woman who wrote Half Breed way back when. So I just want to say a little bit about storytelling and why talk about the fur trade. The storytellers of today are no different from Peter O'Chese or those old people of the 60s or the old women of my childhood. The elders that share stories in this book continue to give us a sense of place, a sense of safety, courage, and vision. Their stories make us laugh and teach us to be better people, families, and communities. And as this book demonstrates, we can also call on the stories that we find elsewhere. I learned from old Peter how important it is to think, to ask questions, and to discuss with others, like we're doing today. Peter never put down Western ways of knowing. He just wanted me to always remember it was not our way of knowing. But he encouraged me to read everything, especially the writings of anthropologists and ethnographers. One day, to illustrate why it was important to do this, he picked up a jigsaw puzzle my children and I had just completed. He lifted it high and dropped it, and pieces flew all over the room. He said, "That's what happened to Wahkohtowin and to our stuff," he said. "Our kinships, our lives, and our teachings are all over the place. Those anthropologists and people who came to our elders to get stories and knowledge recorded everything, and they took it away. Our old people talked to them because they knew that it was the only way that they could save it. Maybe it's not complete, and maybe pieces are missing. But if you know the language and some of the stories, then you have a big piece. And if you work with others who have pieces, and you read the writings and you listen to the tapes of those people that they collected, then you will put our life back together. And when another generation of young people come along and ask questions, you all will be able to share your stories with them, and our people will live through these stories. That is an old man's dream." And so when we tell these stories, they're much more than just mere entertainment, and they teach us how to be better people, how to be better communities. And so opening up your community, Dan, in this fashion is just such a stellar way to talk about the past and how it reflects our current realities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the power of words, and what they can communicate and what they can analogize. It's quite remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here we are on the fur trade, picking up those pieces, putting them back together. So, which leads me to ask Dan, how are you doing this week as a student? How'd you do in the fur trade?
How are your quizzes?
I have 2 100% on my quizzes, so that's the best I've ever done in school. We were talking a little bit about this yesterday. I can't tell you how necessary this course is for me right now in terms of contextualizing a lot of what's going on, I think, in our lives at present. And again, it's so integral to understand the past in order to better understand the future, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think, even in the way that we delved into kind of mercantilism and the way that people came in, and how what began as kind of what felt originally like a relatively successful trading operation really kind of slid into something far more greedy and insidious, and how that really acts as a cautionary tale for now. The fact that billionaires in America have made more money in the past 6 months when so many people are struggling really is a representation of how broken I think this entire system is in the quest for money, commercialism, and the heavy cost that it the toll of what it really takes on people who are not at the top of that system. So to look back and to see what happened, and I think for me it was just so in a way inspiring to see the philosophy of these communities who were very much about supporting their own equally, making sure that people were taken care of. How important that is, and how important it is for us to be aware of that just in terms of how we lead our lives. Because again, I think we can be so distracted by questing for success or questing for money or questing for things that we can often, I think, forget or turn a blind eye to people who might be right beside us who need some help. So there was a lot, I think, that I've taken from it. And I know that in some of the questions that we'll be answering today, I'll be chiming in with my own questions as well. But I really found this chapter to be incredibly formative on a variety of levels, just in terms of, historically speaking, and also kind of spiritually, and what the European desire to acquire things and the systems that were implemented onto people who did not want those systems implemented onto them. It's just it was an eye-opener, and one that I think has really sort of been like the aha moment for me in terms of just looking out for those around me, constantly being aware of who's in need, what can I do with what I have to be of better service to other people. And I think, that's really a really powerful and important message, I think, to take from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think with this learning from this module specifically, a lot of people get stuck in this abstraction of a history. And what I love about what you just said is that it's about relations, right? So everything about Native studies, Indigenous studies, all the sort of the philosophy behind our discipline and behind our work is always about relations, and that matches community and nationhood sovereignty, right? So when we think about Indigenous experience of history, we see where there are strong relations and where there are broken relations. And that's when we see this sort of possessiveness come through, and what you're talking about, right? This history of white possession and settler, settling into the land and possessing land, body, economies, labor. So for me, when I tell my students, it's think about all those elements in which relationality comes into play to understand those experiences, even though if they're in the past. What was it between Donnacona and Cartier that went wrong? When we look at settler perspectives, we only see that economic drive and the drive towards nationhood. But when you see Donnacona's perspective, we see this break and violation of diplomacy and his sovereignty and his relations, right? So I think it's a really good thing that's why the fur trade is important to start the discussion, because it's about relations and relationality. That's central philosophy behind Indigenous engagement.
Yeah. Absolutely, Paul. Well said. So, when we say why talk about the fur trade, it's as Paul said, it's about relationship, and also using these relationships or non-relationships as a dispossession of land and sovereignty. So, did you want to get into our questions?
Sure.
All right. We have Jennifer. I feel like a radio announcer. Now we have Jennifer on the line.
When we get more technology involved, we'll do radio call-ins, and it can
all right.
Do that for you.
And we love you.
Jennifer has a question about appropriation of Indigenous-looking items. When does a non-Indigenous person wearing Indigenous fashion, etc., cross over into appropriation? And we can see the connection. I'll answer this, and then you'll see the connection with the fur trade, actually. So, for example, a non-Indigenous person wearing moccasins or any other item. She used an example 19 years ago. She and her dad went and got heritage photos done at the Calgary Stampede. And they were dressed in Indigenous clothing, which I assume now is similar to blackface. You assume correctly, Jennifer, absolutely. Not acceptable. So there's a few things in here that we could talk about. Firstly, it reminded me of course, in late 19th century till 1951 or so, the nation of Canada, through the Indian Act, banned any Indigenous ceremonies. They banned potlatches, and they also banned Indigenous people from wearing their regalia and ceremonial items. But there was one place where Indigenous people could wear their Indigenous clothing. And I know you guys know the answer, but it was at the Calgary Stampede. And so when I talked to Dan about this, and he says, well, why, why were they allowed to wear it there? And, thinking about that, and if you look in pictures on the internet, you can see that Indigenous people are paraded out, like literally in a parade in their regalia. So why is it that we were allowed to wear it in that specific boundary, and we weren't allowed to wear it in anywhere else, or even do our ceremonies anywhere else? And the fact of the matter is Canada at that time wanted Indigenous people to be a thing of the past. They had residential schools going, and they wanted to assimilate. They wanted to create a country that had no more Indigenous people in it. We were just assimilated and part of the country. So to see us wearing our regalia or ceremonial items outside of something like the Calgary Stampede would indicate that we were still alive, that we were still going strong. And so it needed to be put into a place where it was commodified in a way. So our culture was commodified. It's just like celebrating the past, like Paul said yesterday, I love this wording, a pageantry of romantic primitivism. Stereotypes like the noble savage, on the horse, or the demure Indian princess, those are acceptable Indigenous people at this point in time. So it was just our commodification of our culture. She also asked about the appropriation of Indigenous things. And what I would say is that we have so many Indigenous artists and authors doing so many amazing things out there that you just kind of have to be vigilant. If you're a consumer, if you're someone that likes to shop and buy, I do that anyway. I want to know where my things come from. So if you're getting a hoodie with something like this, I know that this hoodie comes from an Indigenous company. I know these are made by Indigenous people. And so I can tell their, what's the word, provenance for a piece of art? You can tell their provenance, oh, I like your hoodie. Well, this is from so-and-so. They're an Indigenous artist. You go into Banff and you see some really cool little, plastic wooden looking totem poles. You gotta look at the bottom and see where they're at. So you can either really support Indigenous artists and people by being vigilant, or you can buy your trinket and sit with that, I guess. Yeah.
Conscious consuming, I think, is kind of a term that I've heard as well. And I think, I know that I'm a fan of fashion, and I know that the fashion industry has come up time and time again with the idea of appropriation. Where is the line drawn between celebrating cultures and exploiting them? And, I think you were talking yesterday about Valentino, and how the general awareness of how we use people's work has to be from a very real place. This idea of sort of slapping a name on something or selling something in a gift shop is no longer an acceptable way of consuming. We have to really understand where and how things are made, who's making them. And, when it does come to fashion, there are some houses that are celebrating work in real ways, in ways that seem to lift the voices of the artists, so that people can see them and not just, exploit them and have their work in the background or have their names in the background, but have their work in the forefront rather. So I know that you had mentioned like Valentino being kind of a high fashion brand that recently collaborated.
Yeah. Valentino called up Christy Belcourt, who's quite a famous Métis artist and social justice warrior, of course. And and so they collaborated together. And so we had Valentino actually speaking with Christy, offered to fly her over, and she's like, no, just support the people I work with. I don't need to fly to Italy. I'm like, I'd be there. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
But she said, support the people, say that. We'll just do it over. This was 2 years ago. So COVID wasn't even around. And collaborated with her and used her designs, gave her the credit. And, there we see a really nice working of a collaborative relationship, how it probably was early in the fur trade. Everyone getting the what they need out of it and having that true relationship, So I think there's some good examples out there.
And again, Valentino obviously being a very high-end iteration of this concept, but if you simply Google, you will be able to find small businesses, companies, products that are made by people of color, made by Indigenous communities. You are able to it's really just a click away at this point. So there's no excuse, I don't think, for blindly consuming at this point.
That's right.
This summer, I've been binge listening to Media Indigena, which is an amazing podcast. And I was just listening to yesterday, they were talking about Dior's Sauvage fragrance with Johnny Depp and all the fallout that came from that, right? And it's just like, I hear that this amazing conversation between Indigenous media experts like Kim Tallbear and Rick Harp and Collender, forgot her name anyways, but they were talking about like how it's just baked into settler colonialism, this appropriation of the land and its people, and that we can just put ourselves, like a settler person can put themselves inside this imagined wilderness and take in all of those aspects, right? Naturalize. And that goes right through all of history. Like it goes to Champlain's dream of a new France. It comes to like all of the crown, empire building in the fur trade and mercantilism. It's like, it's really all connected. And it's always amazing to hear Indigenous commentators and people thinking about this at every step when that kind of appropriation comes up again.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
Wow, we talk a lot, don't we? That's awesome. We have all these other questions. Question: Michelle and Muriel are asking about the Hudson Bay Company. They want to know more about the HBC selling of Rupert's land to the Canadian government. How important was this, and is this still important today?
Definitely.
Why is it important, Paul?
It's super important because it goes back to this idea of like of discovering North America, and this is like that these French and English and Dutch and like these and Spanish colonial empires just discovering it all. And with the HBC particularly is always fascinating and kind of hilarious the way that Rupert's Land was discovered and then possessed. It's just like Henry or Hank, I call him Hank Hudson, just came in his boat and looked at all the rivers that came into the Hudson Bay, and he said, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine. And all those rivers spread out across the continent, all the way to Edmonton. So it's like there's no perception of how things are, if there's people there, if there's economies already in place. It's just this blind possession, just like Sauvage, right? So it's like, it's really interesting. And it's like the doctrine of discovery that drives this, right? And that's driven by
language too. We were discussing last week, not to interject, but we had discussed last week the importance of language And the fact that discovery is a word that has been used time and time again in our education of these people. They discovered America. This person discovered Canada. They didn't discover a place. It was inhabited. So they visited a place and they just happened to take over. So again, I think the power of words is so crucial to changing history, because these are things that are simply not true. The land was not discovered. It was visited by these people who then took it over. So, you know, it just really kind of in going through this course, you're realizing more and more how powerful these words have been used to influence history and influence the way that we see history.
For sure. It's like these are inhabited places by sovereign political people, and they still are, right? And it's just this empire drive, this drive of empire, right? Like that the merchant, the missionary, and the crown are, you know, driving this possession of land and peoples, right? So like Doctrine of Discovery is a big part of that, and that's something that we still fight for and against all the time, right? That this is undiscovered country, so we will take it for ourselves. They're not Christian, they're not white. They're therefore not human, right? So it's like, it's a really strong, it's incredible to think that Indigenous people have to fight to claim humanity. It's deep, right?
Absolutely, Paul. And you know, learning this history, it is quite shocking that you have this, I guess, entrepreneur type of guy who comes along and he's like, this is mine. Can you imagine going to any country and being able to do that? Everything that drains into the Hudson's Bay, that's all mine. And then to actually sell it back to Canada, you know, oblivious, really, well, maybe not entirely oblivious, but having that understanding that you said, Paul, that these aren't really people. They're not Christians. They don't think the way we do. They don't look the way they do. So they are just part of the flora and fauna of this land, something to be controlled, put away, and not to be seen, and to actually be bought and sold, if you really want to go into that realm as well. When you talk about Indigenous women and the current state that we see ourselves in.
Yeah, and like that, and then again, when it comes to Indigenous women, just focus on. I always love to think about how Indigenous women are the center of the fur trade. Their labor is the center of how things operated. It was women and their relations that brought people together. That, you know, that like led across the land. Like these voyageurs and these like travelers didn't know anything, but women and their communities were leading. And the same thing with the MOOC. It's women's labor that made this MOOC, right? So really, it's all significant. So if we want to affirm Indigenous sovereignty, we affirm Indigenous women's labor and their leadership, right?
Yeah.
So,
It is quite amazing to you know, learn about the role, the significant and powerful role that women played in labor. But also, I remember in last week's lesson, in certain communities, women actually selected the chiefs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was, women need to be in power generally. We need to men have had enough time. We gotta put them in charge to fix everything. It's like, not that they're responsible for fixing things, obviously, but we would be in a very different place if women were in power.
Indeed.
We'll get t-shirts for next class.
Oh man.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that, Dan. And, you know, certainly across Canada, the various First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, they weren't all led by women. But when you look at down on the East Coast, you look at some of the matrilineal or matrilocal people, they have, especially the Mohawks, they have such a strong nation of women there. And you see this building up, you know, you see a lot of academic scholars, leaders, the people that started Idle No More, they were all women. And so you see the shift of Indigenous women really taking that power, and from a grassroots level as much as from like in our area section, academia. I see a lot of Indigenous women coming through university, more so than men, Indigenous men. And so perhaps it is time for us to take our place and be a part of this society.
It was time a long time ago.
Yeah, it's like there's a blip here where the nation state asserted itself. It's a lot of masculine or like sort of androcentrism asserted itself, right? Because the fur trade was all about collaboration. A lot of it was, right? And then things just got more and more like commodified. Relations got more commodified. But if it's, you know, if it's not for communities of men and women, women and men, this fur trade would not happen, right? So we got to go back to those governances of women's participation and power, right? So
yeah, absolutely. All right, so Tasha is wondering about Métis identity. With so much attention on people appropriating cultures, and because our Indigenous relatives are farther back in our lineage, and because I'm white physically, there's part of me that's fearful of openly identifying as Métis. I want to learn about the Métis culture, teach my children, and raise them being proud and informed about the Métis. Am I Métis because I'm mixed? Over to you, Paul.
So, thank you. Am I on this side of the screen? I think I don't want to belabor a long answer to this, because Métis identity is very complicated. And I think with the Métis Nation, there's a lot of like struggle towards asserting Métis sovereignty and Métis national identity against a broader public in Canada, because, and I think this has to do with a lot of Indigenous identity. A lot of Indigenous identity is sort of like stuck in a way in relation to how the settler state defines Indigenous people, right? So we keep talking about relations. If we keep affirming relations as a form of understanding identity, that's the key, you know? Though I cannot for myself speak to First Nations or Inuit identity at all, but as a Métis person, the way I define Métis is that it's a post-contact Indigenous nation that is that has a political centrality, a political history on the plains, on the prairies, across the border, that is like defined by mobility, mixed economies, and kinship, right? So so amazing scholars like Chris Anderson and Brenda McDougall and Nicole Saint-Onge, I look up to them and how they've redefined how we can understand Métis, how we can understand ourselves without affirming a sort of like a racialization or a Métis as mixed paradigm. Because it's like Indigenous identity without community is nothing really. It's just biology or race, right? So every time I think about my wife and my wife Lucy and the work where she was working in Ottawa and in Minwashin Lodge, they would always say, when someone would come to Minwashin Lodge, this woman, Indigenous Women's Center, they would be like, I have an Indigenous person in my background or something. How, you know, I've got a Cherokee something, you know, it's always Cherokee. So they would say, show up, you know, give back, you know, like it's not about who you are way in the back. It's like who you can self-identify, but who identifies you, right? So when I engage the Métis community here in Edmonton, I see myself and I hear the laughter and I see all these different I see the way that people are engaging, you know, politically and passionately. I love that, and it resonates with me, and people recognize me, right? They see the right. So it's all these different aspects of reasserting what it is inside communities. So just show up, stand with your community, and just be part of it. And then you and your children will engage in this, and also go back to your family. So for Métis, it's like, how do you understand all of this dispossession of identity? Go to your family and talk about this dispossession, talk about this racialization, talk about the how in the 50s throughout the early 20th century, if you claim to be Métis, you'd lose your job, you know, you'd get, you know, it's like, it was always if you're brown or if you're white, right? But really, it's like, that is not a helpful paradigm. What's most helpful is how your Indigenous community circles itself and resonates with itself, right? And is like authentic and sort of like connected to other Indigenous nations as well. You're not just a nation, you're also a peoplehood engagement, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
it's about those puzzle pieces coming together, right? That like we're not all separate. We have to assert ourselves and learn again to be with others who are people and more than humans, right? So there's a lot of work to be done for me and for our nations. So this is the whole point of understanding this history and engaging this again.
Yeah.
There's such a power in understanding where you came from and celebrating that, and really, you know, I had mentioned this, you know, in our little chat yesterday, just in terms of, you know, me learning about my Jewish heritage, which is a group of people that have often been run out of, you know, places that they have really built for themselves, and there's a real power and there's a real magic in the bravery of these people and in the sense of community and in the resilience. And I think you're missing out on a real kind of electricity, genetic, historical, ancestral electricity that can course through your veins when you have cultural, when you know where you've come from and you've heard the stories and you're proud of those stories, and you're defined by those stories. You're defined by the strength and the power of the people who came before you. I think there's something really sort of profound about really celebrating who you are in your entirety.
And I think as we educate ourselves and as Canada educates themselves on the history of Indigenous people, you know, you'll see that burst of pride more and more. You don't ever want to see a little kid who's trying to, you know, rub off their brownness in school, as I did. It's heartbreaking. And so to be informed and celebrate that, know where you're from, and be having that pride of where you're from, it absolutely can change your life and how you engage with the world, you know. So one thing I want to mention is Paul said, you know, it's not what you claim to be, it's like who is claiming you. Like you can claim your self-identify, but you do have to be claimed as well. So do your work and be vigilant on that, and ask your family, just like Paul said. It is becoming harder and harder to be a great granddaughter of a Cherokee princess. And, you know, we have those wannabe gray owls and long lances. It's harder to do that. But if you do feel like you have some indigeneity, you can't just claim this without expecting someone to investigate you or your background. And so I suggest that you do that first and get that history and be proud of it, like Paul said.
You bet. Come and enjoy the fiddle. Jeez. Come party.
Marielle has a few questions. So was there a difference between French and English fur traders and fur trading? She says she's under the impression from this week's material that the approach to trading differed between the French and the English, and the French seemed more collaborative, at least from Champlain onward, she says, than the English were. Is this correct?
Yes, well, let me explain myself. Let me just start off saying that I'm not a historian or a fur trade historian, right? Like us, this course is about just getting sort of like a basis, right? And sort of trying to, it's more of a feeling than it is kind of like an intellectual process, and which I absolutely love, right? So we do have reading lists of really amazing fur trade historians who can speak to every single aspect of this. So, and we usually send that out with Dan on the Twitters or whatever. It's actually not at all on Twitter, on Instagram. But really, like the difference is that the HBC was a English monopoly, right? And the English had these things called factories all along the Hudson Bay, all those outlets, right? Like Churchill and Severn and in northern Canada, northern Ontario. So they had these centralized places for a long time, in which they would have easy access to boats that would go straight. They would bring these beaver furs to be transformed into hats, which is amazing. So they would have all this access and all this river access. And that means that they didn't really have to go far to get anything. People just like Indigenous traders just brought things to them, and then things developed. But with the French, it was really like out of Montreal, which is the guy who started McGill University is a fur trader, James McGill or something. But like they were Scotch, and they had this. They had to. So that was the HBC. The Northwest Company and other companies had to go through the river system and down below. So they really had to labor to go out into the field and get their fur trades, to get their furs to trade it back on canoes. So like Anishinaabe, like technology, Ojibwe women's labor, like it's like all along the way, these voyageurs are paddling with Indigenous people, engaging Indigenous trade and labor. So, but it's a lot more labor intensive, and they've hired a lot of French Canadians, voyageurs, right? So that's really a big part of French Canadian identity in the prairies, which is really wonderful and celebrated. And it's central to Métis identity as well, right? That the French traders and Orkney traders married into Indigenous women, but it's the political organization of the Métis in that period. But that's where we see that idea that the French are more engaged with trade than the English. The English are more separated, but really it's all about empire and mercantilism, and also like this idea of Champlain's dream of making red people white, right? Really like becoming part of this nation. So I think like just like in English Canada, French Canada also has to come to grips with its colonial heritage, right? And how French Canadian identity is sometimes appropriates a lot of Indigenous identity. And I really would I suggest for people to read Daryl LaRue's work along those questions of race shifting, because it's deeply connected to the fur trade and to this history. So we don't get into it here, but that's an important socio-political identity aspect that needs to be questioned. So I go for it.
We'll make sure to put that those readings in the list.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Do we have time for another question, Dan?
Sure.
Yeah.
Why not? It's Sunday afternoon.
Why not?
Where's everyone going? Nowhere.
This is about the Hudson's Bay Company again. We often hear of HBC as a symbol of Canadian success, Canadiana, right? A source of pride. We now even see its logo on the clothes worn by Canadian Olympic teams. Even my winter coat has the HBC stripes on it. Not me, Marielle. Marielle? Yeah.
Mireille.
So it seems like HBC itself seems to struggle to recognize its past. I'd like to know what is the current perception of the Hudson's Bay Company by Indigenous peoples? Complex question, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
I noted yesterday when we were chatting that the Tsuut'ina people had just opened up a big Costco on Reserve. And so at the big ribbon cutting, they were wearing masks, but also Hudson's Bay blanket coats. So I had my thoughts on this, but we have to recognize that across Canada, as much as Indigenous people have, varied opinions and things like that, like anyone else. So they were wearing these Hudson's Bay blanket coats as a form of Canadiana. It's really highly visible as something that's Canadian. But there's other people that, are not so fond of HBC and actually not so fond of the blanket and what it represents. So we know there was biological warfare in the past as Canada was trying to not just assimilate, but destroy Indigenous people, in which there's claims that they put smallpox virus on these HBC blankets and then gave them out to communities. So you can see that might have a little bit different thoughts about Hudson's Bay blankets. I'm going to quickly mention this amazing art project that someone used Hudson's Bay blankets in. So in 2013, I believe, the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave the apology for residential schools. It's 2013, hey, Paul? And then in 2014, Harper at a G8 summit said that there was no history of colonialism in Canada. So these two artists took offense to that. And so they created, it's artist Leah Decter and Jamie Isaacs. And it's called The Official Denial, Trade Value in Progress. And so on this, they asked people to participate in this. They sewed these Hudson's Bay blankets together, and they asked people to write what they thought about the apology, what you thought about the claim that there was no history of colonialism in Canada. And so there was these two binders, and you could read what people wrote, and then you could pick one of those writings and either beat it on these blankets, or you could just stitch it in. And so it was a really powerful piece that really talks about how, for me, how artists, Indigenous artists, can take pieces like that and really a symbol of Canadiana and really subvert it and think about it in a colonial way and how colonized, it was. So it's a very complex question. You can see other people celebrating it, and you can see Indigenous artists taking offense to that and subverting the idea.
I mean, this is obviously a whole other conversation, but how could you apologize for something and then not recognize? I mean, none of it makes sense. And I guess, okay, a question that I had, even like just adding to this whole conversation, I know that as Canadians, so much of the Canadian identity has been defined by the Hudson's Bay blanket. It's like canoes, maple syrup, Mounties, Hudson's Bay blankets, beavers.
Beaver.
Where do you stand, just for people at home who might be curious, in terms of the way that they, if I have a Hudson's Bay blanket at home, and I, would very much value your opinions on whether you think they are okay to have at home, because I'm sure that so many of us who are watching right now really had no idea of the significant symbolization of what that blanket can represent to people. So, personally, obviously acknowledging that communities have different perspectives on this, but where do you stand on the blanket?
I don't have one. As tempting as it is, I have relatives, like Canadians, that have become Americans, and I'm tempted sometimes to send them something like that, just to reminisce of home. I guess I romanticize it a little bit, and perhaps that's what other people do as well, Canadiana. But as an Indigenous person, especially an Indigenous woman, I don't feel as proud of my country as I want to. I feel a little bit let down. And so Canadian symbols, as much as I want to enjoy them and celebrate them, because I live in Canada, which is an amazing country on many levels, there is still this deep, well, what are you doing about, and we spoke about this, Dan, what are you doing about, the many First Nations and communities that don't have clean water? How can I be proud of that when I personally know people who haven't been able to shower on their reserve for 8 years because the water is so bad? So I'm not claiming to dislike it or, obviously do not hate my country. I just think there's so much more that we could do to celebrate all of us. I'd love to see a day where I celebrate and I wear a blanket because maybe Hudson's Bay did something amazing and has these ongoing water solutions for First Nations communities. I'd be proud to wear something like that.
So there is a world where something can be done to recontextualize what the blanket means.
I think so.
Okay.
Well, so just to add to this is that I think we have to focus on Indigenous sovereignty here. And this is what Tracy's talking about like water sovereignty and the relationships with the Crown and with the government. And we'll talk about this in next modules. But like the blanket itself, the Métis make jackets out of these blankets. They're called capotes, right? So, and for me, it's just like, well, then there's the Hudson Bay kind of legacy of mercantilism and capitalism. And then there's this like pure like symbolic engagement with this blanket, and you see that with the Tutsina in that instance. So for me, I keep thinking, oh, so then how do I go back into history and make relations with it and see those relations and see where there's disconnects, right? You know, to see where there are nations that had nothing to do with the HBC, so and celebrate that, right? Like the Blackfoot, the Siksika, you know, like, and to see how the Cree and the Métis engaged in the HBC in their own way, right? So there's all these different aspects that have to do with where do we assert and like sort of lift up Indigenous sovereignty when they make relations with things like material culture, political systems, language, you know, so that it doesn't become sort of like a deficit model, but it's always about Indigenous engagement and bringing it into the family, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so wrapping up, we have Jillian from Victoria is asking about social economies, Indigenous fur trading families and women. We know that the family prior to contact was not homogenous nor heteronormative, and Indigenous women's roles in the fur trade. So Paul's talked a lot about relationship and kinship, and oftentimes when we think about kinship or our family, it's not just our nuclear family that consists of a heteronormative, like a mom and a dad and the 2.5
husband children and wife, you know.
It's not seen like that. And so we think of a much more extended sort of family. It's even embedded in our language. So where we have, for Cree, for instance, you know, you have a mother, Nikowi, and then Nikosis is little mother. So my sister would be just like a mother to my children, not an auntie, a little mother. And so it's embedded in our culture to have in our languages to see kinship as a wider spread thing. For Cree anyway, we lived in teepees where families were all in these teepees, and the women owned the teepee and everything inside it, including the children. And so, you know, families lived together, and there wasn't this very strict nuclear family. You had your mother living with you, your father, perhaps an extended family. So when we see the role sort of that the government played, really needed to take that apart. And so that heteronormative nuclear family with a mom and dad was really pushed. There was no more, there was marriages, I guess, from the church, and there wasn't any people taking on more than one wife anymore, or more than one husband in some cases. And so that sort of nuclear family changed. We have a language and a worldview of thinking about an extended family, but it really changed when it came down to that, especially with women's roles, women's owning things. And then in Canadian law at that time, you know, prior to 1912, women were seen as property. And so we see a real difference of worldview in that. And so as we see, history is from male gaze. And oftentimes when I'm looking at my history, Indigenous women, they didn't even have names in the historical ledgers. It would just be like a Cree woman or a Blackfoot woman. And so they never say their names. And that's part of that property and patrilineal history that we have, right?
Can I also add to this too, is that Chris Anderson, who's our dean of our faculty, our amazing faculty, so proud. He said once to me, he goes, in the fur trade, you don't trade with strangers. And I found that so amazing to see that, like, oh yeah, that's what the fur trade was about. It was about making kin to then create these like bigger, more safe communities, right? And when we start to not to see our kin as strangers, that's when structures fall apart, right? And that's what happened to the fur trade in the 1800s. It's just like this, like, just no more. We don't want to know you or even do anything with you. We're just business partners, you know? And you're like,
and it's interesting because the less you get away from actual human interaction, the less you have to care about the fallout of the decisions that you make. So it's a very curious thing to see distance. just between people. And I feel like right now we couldn't be farther from each other in terms of the politics that's happening. And it allows for people to believe things and not have the consequence of their own conscience, knowing, you know, who people are. I truly believe that if we actually just hold each other and talk to each other, that a lot of change will come. But it's people are hiding behind their beliefs, and those beliefs are actually inhibiting kinship to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Just hold each other in COVID, eh?
I know. Can you tell that I need some physical interaction?
Hug me.
Hug to the world.
Oh,
Yeah,
hug the world
exactly.
indeed.
So, is it time for me to read my poem?
Yeah, I believe it is.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
I got permission, of course, from Marilyn Dumont. This is from her book, That Tongue Belonging. And I think it exemplifies what we've been talking about here today, the power of women and the loss of power. If we are pictured too easily, it's because we're a generation of ingredients folded in a sordid recipe. Our female relatives, uneasy, aware, brown flour and salt women know intimately the look of reproach and desire some men hold for us. Our piercing cheekbones, alert dark eyes, while our warm olive skin in a certain light unsettles them, threatens their ambitions if they take us anywhere but the backseat of a Chevy. If we are pictured too easily a certain kind of woman, it's because our denigration started long ago. A tradition of gentlemen, explorers, fur traders, company men, investing little more than the fickle heart of commerce in our company. So that now when a 12-year-old Indian girl is raped in Saskatchewan, or when an Indian woman is set on fire in Edmonton, or when many Indian women disappear on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, our skin too crawls from their violation, and we breathe an air heavy with death song while our grandmothers rattle the doors of justice.
That's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
Extraordinary writer.
And
that, again, is from Marilyn Dumont's The Tongue Belonging.
Yeah.
That we'll put up.
we will put
She's
that
a professor she's a professor at the University of Alberta in English and Film Studies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Storytelling.
Storytelling. So important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I cannot thank you enough for your time today. It's been invaluable to all of us, and I can't wait to reconvene next week and continue.
Mm-hmm.
This has
Should
been
be a good one.
a
With
gift.
special guest.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
you very much, everybody, and thank you at home for tuning in.
Mm-hmm. Merci.